Hi, I'm Mark Bernard, and I'm here with the Bernard Institute for Cybersecurity Excellence. And today I'm providing instruction over lesson number 4. And I hope that you enjoy this lesson. It's one of my favorite. It's all about the risk assessment, which is the heart of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. So please, if you have a pencil and notepad, don't forget to take some notes. And risk assessment is part of the first module, Identify. It's located within the reference model right over here, as you can see. And we magnified a little bit so that you can see that. As part of this lesson, we're going to take you from basically a no understanding or very low understanding to understanding the topic completely, and hopefully being able to use that knowledge to apply in your workplace. Now, there are other levels of knowledge transfer that we're not going to touch on today, but you will experience them as you work with the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. So you'll be able to troubleshoot problems once you get more familiar with it, and you'll be able to maybe audit the program and also provide some advice or oversight with architecture of designing new implementations or new instances of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework in different organizations or different parts of your organization. The goals within the risk assessment process are: asset vulnerabilities are identified and documented. Cyber threat intelligence is received from information sharing forums and sources. Threats, both internal and external, are identified and documented. 4, potential business impacts and likelihoods are identified. And 5, threats, vulnerabilities, likelihoods, and impacts are used to determine risk. So these are all slightly variations of the risk assessment, but each represents a specific goal or control point within the process that needs to be achieved as part of the process. And finally, 6, risk responses are identified and prioritized. Now, I've created some questions in order to help transfer that knowledge. What type of vulnerabilities do your assets maintain? That's one question we'll answer. Another question we will answer is, how do you receive cyber threat intelligence today? Have you identified any internal or external threats within your organization? Perhaps as part of your role within the organization, you've already been looking at risk around cybersecurity, and you may already have some ideas of where threats and risks live. What is the likelihood of business impact being realized? So this is slightly different than a disaster recovery or business continuity. That's sort of the extreme impact of a cybersecurity event, such as perhaps a successful ransomware attack might require the restoration of a complete database or system, but that's very extreme. So we're hoping that if you adopt the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, that you'll be able to detect and respond to threats before they become an issue. Number 5, how are threats, vulnerabilities, and impacts used to determine risk? And how do you prioritize your risk response? So to help explain this, we have this really cool waterfall. It starts with a scoping exercise by when you're first asked to do a risk assessment, pardon me, you might ask, well, what's included in that? Are we talking about one location? Are we talking about one system? Are we talking about a region? Are we talking about maybe offices within a specific continent? Maybe it's Asia, maybe it's Europe or America, or maybe it's Canada. There might be a specific scope that you have to look at, and then you have to identify what are the assets within that scope. So for instance, if it was in the US and you had 5 data centers, you might be doing the risk assessment against those 5 data centers, for example. Or if it's a particular business application that your company uses, and that application is used across the globe, then you might be looking at the different assets that have access to that service, to that application. And if you remember earlier in lesson 1, we talked about asset management. We talked about the 6 assets that I use in order to determine what the risk is. And that is, assets are people, information, software, hardware, telecommunications, and facilities. And again, the reason why I differentiate between ordinary hardware or infrastructure hardware and telecommunication hardware is because infrastructure hardware almost always is used to record or store or process information. And if you're concerned about privacy legislation and compliance with that, it's an important note, because you might have additional safeguards around those servers or those appliances that are doing the processing. Whereas telecommunication is almost always the data is transitory. So the data flows through it one way and flows through it the other way. So it's the vulnerabilities to that type of system are, of course, eavesdropping and interception and things like that, whereas those don't really apply to a piece of hardware. So anyway, so just to help you understand that, so there's 6 assets, again, information, people, software, hardware, telecom, and facilities, and they all have unique vulnerabilities. So we look at the assets. We might take a couple iterations at reviewing the assets in scope until we get a really clear or refined understanding. It may not be perfect, so don't expect to hold the risk assessment off until you get all of the assets in scope. At some point, you're going to have to say, I need to finish this risk assessment and do it with the assets that I know about. And if other assets pop up, then we'll bring them into scope. We got to determine what the vulnerabilities are associated with those assets. So again, I mentioned that people have unique vulnerabilities, such as the flu season, or perhaps the continuity of a service may depend on the skills or experience of people in a position. So there may be some kind of succession planning going on in order to make sure that we mitigate the loss of that knowledge or experience. Information, again, same kind of idea. Is information is backed up. We have multiple iterations. We keep backups. We record transactions. So we have a pretty constant understanding of what those information assets are and what they're exposed to. So sort of power outages, any kind of thing that might interfere with the service. Maybe it's an act of nature, earthquake or a fire might interrupt that. And if you have a cloud, then you're not so worried about that, because you might have other instances in other continents where you'll be okay. But if there's only one data center, you might be extremely concerned about that. So we got to look at all the vulnerabilities around those assets. Hardware, the same. Power failures. Telecom, the same. And interception, I mentioned before. And then facilities, of course, any sort of physical break-in. If you don't have a good security parameter, you don't have security officers, you don't have a front desk person to check people in and out of the building, you may be exposed to some social engineering attacks. Okay, so you get a list of the vulnerabilities, and then you look at the impact. So what happens if one of those vulnerabilities actually get exploited by a threat? Could we lose confidentiality? Could we have a breach of privacy? Is it possible that the integrity of the data might be jeopardized because of business process? And about 50% of the controls that we look at involve reviewing the process. So step-by-step processes, following those processes, making sure that employees are trained on the process and following the process. So we do audits to make sure that happens. The integrity of a process is of the utmost importance in order to maintain the integrity of the data. So we look at the business impact, again, to confidentiality, integrity, and of course availability. We've talked about what the loss of information might mean. So we might need to do a complete restore. So we'll do a couple reviews of the CIA and make sure that we've got all the impacts identified. And then we're going to look for matching threats. So there are literally thousands, maybe millions of threats out there in the universe. Threats are not, sometimes get confused with malware. Some people will say, oh, a piece of malware is a threat to the organization. Well, actually it's not. So malware is a tool that threat agents use. So let's be clear about this. Threats are actually people. And the tools that they use are malware, social engineering, different tactics that they use to infiltrate and steal information away from organization. So we look for the matching threats. So who would be a threat to your organization? Well, that might depend on what you do, what industry you're in. Are you in banking? Are you in government? Are you in the military? Do you make decisions about weapons? Where are you in the critical infrastructure, which is something else that we look at in this course, in this program. And then you can identify who the threats are. You can get a clearer picture. And we have a process to go through to evaluate the threats that we'll talk about. So you identify the matching threats. And there might be more than one threat to your asset. So we need to identify all the threats. And then we need to look at the existing controls. So most of our computer infrastructure and systems already have controls in place, and we don't want to throw away the investment that the board of directors or the senior management team have invested in our organization. So we have to give them some credit for what they've already done. That's the right thing to do. And not only that, we might actually uncover, as we do the risk assessment, an exposure to a threat that could be easily mitigated by doing a little fine-tuning on the controls that exist today. So we have firewalls, we have intrusion prevention systems, we have access control systems. We have lots of different layers of control within an organization in order to make sure that the data stays safe. The data is in the middle somewhere, of course, being protected by these multiple layers. So we'll look at those controls and we'll see do we really need a new control or can we fine tune a control? But most importantly, we're giving credit to the management team for implementing controls, which is very important. And we don't lose that investment. And then the next step is to report it. So we report it to the governance committee, and they meet and make the decision on whether they want to accept the risk, they want to transfer the risk, or they want to reject the risk. And then based on that decision, if they want to mitigate the risk, then we have to get to work and come up with a game plan. Now, by the time you've already created this report, you should have already sit down with the manager who's been assigned the responsibility for the assets or the controls over those assets in order to be able to come up with a game plan. So this is really, really important, especially if you're the leader of the cybersecurity program, because you want to engage employees and management. You want to get them involved in the process because it's everybody's responsibility to do cybersecurity. We know that. But we need to have a good attitude, a good approach, a good strategy in order to get people on side. So one of the things that we do is when we assign responsibility for controls or for information assets is we regularly consult with those people in order to get their decision on these things. So we don't make the decision, we facilitate decisions as cybersecurity experts. We give advice, we make recommendations, but the final decision is always with the designated manager who's been assigned that responsibility. It's part of their job. So we get that report. We call it a corrective and preventative action report. We bring that with us with the risk assessment and the findings to the governance committee and make the presentation to them. And then they make a decision on what they want to do when it comes to risk treatment. All right, so that's the waterfall. That's one-page summary and a good explanation of what that looks like. Risk treatment plans, I think I just mentioned corrective and preventative action plans. That's what those usually are. Sometimes what we do is we'll accumulate a number of risks and build a project in order to mitigate a bunch of risks. Other times, we might just put a corrective or preventative action plan. The task might assign it through a service desk ticket and have the manager who's responsible for that area manage that, allocate his resources and time, and manage it from that end. And then we just follow up to make sure it's done. So there's an assignment and a date to be completed, and then we follow up on that. Okay, let's move on now. What type of vulnerabilities do your assets maintain? Before you can determine what kind of vulnerability your assets are exposed to, you might want to do an inventory. So we mentioned this in lesson 1. You need to start doing an inventory of all these assets that we talked about. Again, people, information, software, hardware, telecom, and facilities. Information is not always easy to get, especially if you're very new to the information security business and cybersecurity business, and your organization has never done this type of thing before. So one of the tricks that I use is that, or techniques rather, is to get a list of the software. So I'll ask about the information if it's not obvious. I mean, we might have customer lists, we have employee information, we know about that. We have financial records and reports, we know about that, right? But to get a really clear picture about what's going on when it comes to information assets, we might get the list of applications that we use first. Every application has a database, okay, and they have some defined fields and criteria within that database, and that will give us also a list of information assets that we have within our organization. So that's one way to do that. So you need an inventory. Again, I mentioned several times about the inventories being or the assets being grouped into 6 categories. This is to streamline the cybersecurity program process. For instance, some types of information might be date of birth, driver's license, or social insurance or social security number. People are another asset. We talked about software. Software is on a lot of different devices. It's not just enterprise software on your server. There's productivity software. There's also software on all the appliances. So firewalls have software. Intrusion prevention systems have software. Smartphones have apps, which are software. Tablets and laptops have software. Usually they are the same as what you would see on a desktop in your office. So there's lots of software around. And there's lots of hardware too. So again, you have desktops, smartphones, you have tablets, laptops, you have servers, and many other pieces of hardware. If you look at all the infrastructure hardware, you have load balancers, and you have firewalls, and you have maybe proxy services, and you have servers and switches and routers. So there's lots of different types of information on those pieces of hardware, but they are hardware. And then telecom, mentioned telecom. Of course, the differentiation is that hardware stores information, processes information, but telecom is more of a conduit, or data is transitory on that conduit. It passes through it, and the telecom device just directs it in the right location. And then, of course, facilities. So your offices, your warehouses, any place that you might cross-dock or store information, or you might develop information. Maybe you're in the pharmaceutical business, you have laboratories. Maybe you're in the health business, you have clinics. There's a lot of different facilities that might have assets within them, and there may be a requirement for some kind of physical security around that facility. Okay. Question number 1 continued. What type of vulnerabilities do your assets maintain? Vulnerabilities come in 3 categories. There's human, and I mentioned before, threats are human. And then there's threats initiate attacks against assets. There's non-human, and then there's nature. So non-human are like robots and things that can be, I guess, programmed and then let loose, right? And then there's nature, and of course that's, earthquakes, floods, what have you. So those are types of vulnerabilities that we're exposed to. The top 8 vulnerabilities are architectural deficiencies, defects in final products, misconfiguration, advanced technology, nature, environmental, human behavior, and production material preconditions. So I think these speak for themselves. I can give you a quick explanation. So architectural design can be deficient depending on how it's been built, who's built it. Defects in final products. So maybe we've created a brand new laptop, but there's a deficiency in the chip that we load on that laptop, and because of that, it's vulnerable to interception. Misconfiguration speaks for itself. If you don't enter the right security parameters on a device, on a firewall, or on another device that's protecting the information, it might be easy to bypass it. Advanced technology. So we're talking about, right now we deal a lot with more traditional linear technology, but there's other technology that's coming. So as you probably have heard, artificial intelligence, it's still a little ways out yet. It's not here yet. And then there's, of course, robots, and that type of technology might be able to be used against the hardened system that's already been hardened against the more traditional threats and vulnerabilities. Perhaps some of this advanced technology can bypass it somehow. Okay, and then there's, of course, the big change that's coming is quantum computing. And that's a completely different architecture of an information system. It doesn't, they have data lakes, and the way that they handle data and process data is completely different. The old systems that we have now are more linear, so it's kind of like input and then output through the chip and then back to the hard drive or transmitted somewhere. So that type of technology is going to be replaced eventually. Nature, we know about nature. Okay, again, floods, fires, earthquakes, that type of stuff. environmental. So when we talk about environmental, what we're talking about is if you have a data center and it's the middle of Arizona or another type desert, and it needs air conditioning, if the power goes out and there's no air conditioning, what happens to the servers? Okay, they heat up because servers give off heat and they need to be kept cool in order to run efficiently. And if that's not possible, then we might have not a meltdown, but almost like a meltdown. We might have a situation where the system stops functioning, right? So environmental conditions, we're talking about how do we keep the systems and the people, of course, are important assets, cool and keep them running efficiently. Human behavior. We have bad actors and good actors. 99.9% of employees are good. There's always a small percentage of employees that are up to stuff. So we see this sometimes. If you have a security operations center and you're monitoring the security operations screen, you see stuff happening sometimes. And you have to go and ask people, what were you thinking, trying to get access to that system? Do you need it to do your job, right? Is there some kind of problem? And usually that will clear up things pretty quick. And then production material preconditions. So if you're in the job and if your company is in the business of manufacturing something, so maybe you're pharmaceutical, you're making drugs, maybe there's a problem with your supply chain. And of course, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework talks a lot about supply chains, right? So this is a really important topic that you'll want to, get a hold of. There's other types of preconditions. So if you're making silicon chips, there could be problems or flaws or defects with the chips or the chip manufacturer. There's many types of preconditions that you might want to look at when you look at vulnerabilities. Okay, question number 2. How do you receive cybersecurity threat intelligence? Okay, the first step is to identify what threats are relevant. This requires a risk assessment. So you always need to do a risk assessment. Risk assessment, as I mentioned before, is the backbone of any information security or cybersecurity program. Additional considerations include the organization's culture, industry, and mission. So that's important too. Because in some organizations, the culture is very loose. It's informal. People might come in and leave, and you might not know who they are, right? In other organizations, they might have to leave their driver's license at the door. So culture can be very different in many different organizations. And of course, their industry, are they manufacturing lollipops and selling them? Maybe not a big risk, but it could be a risk to humans if the product gets contaminated. And what is their mission? What are they doing? What is the nature of their business? Why are they in business? Why are they an organization? What are they doing? So that might have some sort of bearing on what kind of threat intelligence you gather. You got to measure that risk because you need to be able to respond to it. Here are a few sources for threat intelligence. So you can check on these. These are very good sources. uscert.gov is a good one. The FBI.gov is another one. cve.mitre.org is a good one. They have the common vulnerabilities. Project Honeypot is another good one. Has lots of intelligence about what threat agents are looking for. The exploit database is a good place to gather some intelligence about what kind of exploits are readily available for download. And of course, the big risk with that is that you don't really need any knowledge about the infrastructure or the architecture or the technology that a company uses. If you have an exploit that's already been crafted, you might just be tempted to hit the enter button and release it. And if you do, it could cause some damage. But the point is that the exploit database dumbs down the need to have any sort of skill or capability. All you need to do is be able to download stuff from the internet and execute it. The OWASP has been a good project for many years, and it's helped improve application security. It has a list of top 10. You'll see that some of those top 10 risks show up year after year. There's never usually a huge change, but what it has done is provided some input into sharing knowledge about how we can prevent these threats in the development process. Okay, so those are some good organizations. Register on these sites, receive regular updates. They probably will also offer podcasts and maybe occasionally have a briefing session If you're a security officer within an organization, you can probably contact them directly and get access to information that's not readily available to the general public. Large organizations will dedicate resources to creating honeypots. So honeypots are really valuable. It does cost money to set up a honeypot properly and to maintain it. But what a honeypot is it's a server that you put out usually in your DMZ. So in your demilitarized zone, that's, all your systems are 2 firewalls from the internet. So the first firewall, after you get past that, is a demilitarized zone. And a lot of times we put in some servers in here and other types of devices that need to have access to the internet. And then we have another firewall, and the second firewall protects our infrastructure. So the honeypot will go in there. You might load it with some superficial data that looks real but might not be that valuable. And then you might configure the device so it looks like a normal server, but what you might do is not patch all the patches that are on it. So there may be some security vulnerabilities that for instance, on a Linux system or what have you, and you don't install all of them. So how this looks to a threat agent is that, they got past the first firewall, and now they're in your DMZ and they spot a server and they're logging into it, right, trying to test it to see if it has any vulnerabilities. The first thing they'll do is they'll check like the CVE database, the Common Vulnerability and Exposure Database, and they'll see if they can get in with one of those vulnerabilities, and they might have a piece of exploit code already configured to do that. So then we can monitor that. So we have intrusion prevention system or intrusion detection system. It's gathering data as they're going at this system, and it's feeding it back into the security information event management system. So we're monitoring it and we're learning about the intelligence of the threat. And now we're going to take that intelligence and we're going to formulate it and upgrade and improve our security by hardening it more, and also talking to senior management about it, because they have no idea who's attacking them and why. And this type of threat intelligence is extremely valuable to them. So the risk assessment might help by suggesting that a honeypot get created. Okay, question number 3. Have you identified internal and external threats to your organization? Threats can occur externally or internally. So disgruntled employees in particular can cause problems because they have several valuable capabilities, right? So they have skill because that's why we hired them. They have experience because they work with us for a while. So they know our infrastructure. They know our processes. They know who signs off on what. They know who's responsible for what. So if an employee goes rogue or becomes disgruntled in their job, we might have a serious problem, more serious than an external threat indeed. So that might be something that we have to deal with. Usually we can detect some of these things because there's some behavioral activity that these types of threats do, and we can monitor for that, such as, for instance, if an employee thinks that they're going to be terminated because they're up to something no good, they might start emailing stuff to themselves, to their private email account. So if we're monitoring the outbound traffic, email and websites and that sort of stuff, we might be able to get a step ahead of what's about to happen. So we have an internet, it's connected to the cloud. Our assets are usually connected through that internet. And then we have a number of vulnerabilities that can be exploited, and these vulnerabilities are usually left unpatched in the honeypot so that we can identify who the threats are that are coming from the internet. Have you identified internal external threats? Continued. To fully understand, you need to conduct a threat assessment evaluation. We talked about the process before. Each threat is based on a scale of 1 to 5 with an overall percentage based on the 100% scale. We look at 4 threats. We look at skill. So there's a couple data points here. How much skill is required? Do they have the skill that's required in order to attack our system? How much knowledge do they have? I mentioned before about insider threat. That knowledge would be extremely high with a disgruntled employee or a rogue employee. resources. How many resources do they need to attack the system? So perhaps we have multiple layers. Some groups, like Anonymous, for instance, might have threat actors positioned around the globe. They may come at the system from different IPs. They may be cloning or cloaking their IPs. Some simple security systems look at IP addresses and they block by IP or by domain name services. So maybe they can bypass that somehow if they have multiple people attacking the system at once. What is their motive to do that? Are they upset with us? Did we do something to upset people? We want to be careful about what we do in our business to make sure that people don't get upset with us so that we can carry on. Perhaps it's money. Maybe they're organized crime. They want to profit from it. They want to attack our point of sale systems. They want to get into our treasury or our general ledger, and they want to have some money transferred to them. Or maybe they're going to conduct ransomware. The other motive might be from a foreign government, for instance, or competitors, that they want to steal our intellectual property so that they can bolster their own business or their own economy and compete against us without having to do the investment in research and development. How about capability? How capable are they? How much processing power do they need? Now, you might have heard about botnets. Botnets are where you can actually rent a computer. It's a cluster, actually, so it's multiple computers connected together. And of course, when you connect multiple computers processing together, you get like a supercomputer kind of effect happening. So you can rent these. You can rent them at universities or other places, right? I'm not saying universities have botnets, but they usually have supercomputers that you can use that are clusters. But botnets are usually global, and you can rent them on the dark web. So capability, do they have access to that? So skill, knowledge, resources, motive, and capability. So we evaluate them on 5 points in order to come up with basically a rating of 1 to 5 on how dangerous are these threats to us. So this is also called threat modeling. Number 4, what is the likelihood of a business impact coming? Do we have underground cables, such as this fiber that's been, looks like it's been wrecked, it's been broken in half, what a mess, because somebody was digging somewhere and they didn't know about this underground cable. So that is unfortunate. What other exposures do we have? Pardon me. What are the impacts to our organization if a cable gets broke like this? Do we have redundancy? Do we have another cable, and hopefully it's not the one right beside that one, but another cable going somewhere else in the organization, to an external service provider? Sometimes maybe we use a different technology. Maybe it's, we have fiber, but we also have microwave dishes. There might be a number of ways, depending again on the value of the information in our business. We might have multiple layers of control built up in order to mitigate any sort of risk. So we've got to look at the business impact. Again, loss of confidentiality, loss of integrity, or loss of availability are the 3 principles of information security and cybersecurity. And in order to quantify that, you need to do the risk assessment, of course. And also ask if there's been a history of problems before. So this is more of a qualitative approach. It's not one that I recommend, but it's qualitative risk assessments can easily be defeated in any sort of argument because they're not really evidence-based. But you should ask the managers who have been there for a while, do they recall any sort of business impact, any losses of confidentiality or integrity of data or availability, because that will help build credibility within your program and also engage other managers in the process, which is great. What is the likelihood of business impact being realized? So we look at the business impact based on quantifying the principles again. CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Loss of confidentiality, for example, could be a breach or unauthorized disclosure. Loss of integrity could be a manual or automated process was not completed. So we have step by step that needs to be followed. If someone goes from step A to step Y and misses a whole bunch of steps in between, we might have a problem with the information that they're working on or sharing with other people. Loss of availability. Again, we don't want to lose information temporarily or permanently. For example, one of the things we might do is we might create an encryption policy that says that encryption will be approved by the information security officer or the chief information security officer, and it has to be that way because we don't want people encrypting their own data, because if they get disgruntled or if they leave or retire, we may not have access to the keys to unlock that data, so that would be a problem for us. Use a 3-tier scale, similarly to what we discussed before, high, medium, low, and then we can use this to calculate the business impact. Assign a value if it's possible. This is always, it's one step further. In some of the projects I worked in, we can do evaluation immediately. In other projects, it might take several months or a year before we get to the point where we can actually start assigning values to assets, because the knowledge transfer that goes on, the digital transformation, if you like, that goes on when you implement a cybersecurity program requires time. You have to get people on side. You have to get people thinking in the right process before you introduce new concepts. Because if you throw all the concepts at them at once, sometimes it's too much. They stop, right, and they back up, and then you lose them. So you want to do a little bit at a time, cookie crumbs, engage them, get them to buy into it, show them how easy it is, and help support them. Continuity, contingency, and succession plans will improve the analysis. So any type of planning that's already been done might have data that you can leverage. The business impact assessment is one of those examples. Business impact assessments, or BIAs, have been used for a long, long time for disaster recovery and business continuity. Number 5, how are threats and vulnerabilities and impacts used to determine risk? Okay, use a risk assessment to calculate the risk rating based on a 100% scale. List assets in scope and identify the exposure to the known vulnerabilities. Quantify the business impact, loss of confidentiality, integrity, or availability. Analyze the threats, determine likelihood based on capability, motive, and opportunity. We talked about that. Test existing control effectiveness to see if the existing controls are working, if they can be optimized or tweaked in a way that will address the risks that we've identified. Perfect, because now we don't have to buy anything new. There's no procurement exercise. Management would love you for that because you're saving money and you're leveraging the existing investment that they've already made in security. Calculate the risk assessment based on a formula such as this. So asset vulnerability times business impact times threat exposure minus any existing control effectiveness equals the total. The total value is divided over the 100% scale. Okay, so the total value might change for each of the different assets. So we want to be able to roll this all up. So we want everything to be based on a 100% scale, and that leads to something called a risk rating. Okay, 5. How are threats, vulnerabilities, and impacts used to determine risk? Well, I like to use a bit of influence here from the Vikings. So the Vikings obviously were great explorers. They explored the world. They conquered many different peoples, and there are many colonies of Vikings that still exist today around the world. One of the things they used to do is they used to like to use tattoos. So they would put a tattoo on themselves of a chevron. So it may be 1 chevron or 3 or 2, but in their culture, a chevron is used to symbolize moving forward and creating your own reality, which I think is very applicable to doing risk assessments, because we want to move forward with risk management within the organization. We want people to think about risk, right? In order to move that forward, in order to move forward and take on the challenge of cybersecurity threats and risks, we need to move forward. We need to change the way that we've done things in the past and become more efficient at it. So the chevron is a really good symbol to think about when it talks about moving forward. There's another symbol too that they use to tattoo, and that tattoo is called an arrow. But the arrow had a special symbolicity with them. And it symbolized where there is a will, there's a way. So the two of these combined, they look similar to a fishbone, but they are different. And so we have where there's a will, there's a way. So you're determined to move forward and create your own reality. That's what we get out of this. Okay. Now we need to pick a target. The target could be a product or a service when we do a risk assessment. That's my recommendation. We want to do something that's valuable, something's tangible, something that senior management recognizes. So picking a particular service, a revenue stream that has some value to the organization, identifying what the cyber risk is involved in that would be very valuable to the cybersecurity program and also to senior management and the governance committee. And then we want to evaluate the risks around the assets and the controls. So we will map in the controls. We identify these assets. So people, information, and facilities are all physical type of assets. And then we have the technology type of assets. So software, hardware, and telecom. And where you see the little arrows here, this is where we would actually record the controls that we're going to put in place to mitigate any risk to these different types of assets. How do you prioritize your risk response? The risk rating is used. This is called a quantitative risk assessment. Qualitative risk assessment doesn't come up with a risk rating, but a quantitative one does. And I mentioned to you how we do that. Risk rating falls on a 5-scale integrated system described below. So we have extreme risks. So when we go through the waterfall and we get to the bottom and 3 blocks before the bottom, we calculate a risk rating before we do the report. There's a table that risk rating will fall into, and the table is based on a 5-scale system. And so the highest risk ratings will fall into the 90 plus category. And we have some service level agreements in place and service desk ticketing. So this is considered a priority 1. It takes 2 hours to recover. So if you do a risk calculation on something and it's a 90 or above, then there needs to be immediate treatment of that risk. Critical is just one step below. So this might be also very important to us, but we have a little bit more time to fix it. So you have 4 hours to recover it. So an example of extreme could be a 0-day attack, for instance. Example of critical code could be a new vulnerability that the vendor or the supplier of our databases or our servers has just announced publicly. So we need to treat that within 4 hours. And usually between critical and high, within the risk management policy, and we're going to talk about that in the next lesson, there is a threshold that's set. So anything that's 80 or above gets treated immediately. Anything that's 79 or below is allowed to have more time, more planning put into it in order to resolve it. So we try to fit it into the regular type of processes, projects that we have, or change windows that we have, things that are coming up that allow us to manage, let the management team manage these changes to the organization and to the security posture. So for instance, high criticality, that's a code red, and all of these have colors with them, as you noticed. Risk rating is between 60 and 79. It takes 10 days to resolve that type of risk. Medium is a code yellow, and it takes around 30 days to resolve. So you have more time. So this one can definitely fit into. So high could probably fit into a change window, because usually we have change windows once a week. 30. This might be more of a maintenance task. So we can say that this risk is not a big impact to our organization, but it still needs to be addressed in order to keep our security posture nice and firm. So we're going to give them 30 days to resolve that. Low is code green. So 0 to 29 days or 90 days to resolve. 0 to 29 risk rating or 90 days to resolve. So 90 days is a long time. It's a quarter. And we've kind of built this on purpose, because some of the vendors that we have, such as Cisco and Oracle, only release patches on a quarterly basis. So we want to make sure we're not certain that any of the patches that they send out will be anything higher than a risk rating of low. We think it's just regular maintenance, so we want to make sure that we provide a way to get those fixes in and also to rank them as a risk to the organization. So there's your 5-scale system: extreme, critical, high, medium, and low. And the formula, again, we talked about this before. It's the asset vulnerability times the business impact times the threat exposure minus existing control effectiveness gives you a total, and then you divide that total over 100% and it equals your risk rating. Now we have some practice statements. Now usually when I'm doing a seminar or a workshop, we'll go through these practices as part of our workshop, but because this is online training, it's up to you to do. So if you do have questions, of course you can send us questions online and we'll be happy to answer them. But we wanted to give you some practice statements so that you can learn to take some of the knowledge that we just gave you and put it into use, right? And get familiar with how to do it. So first step, you have to create an asset inventory. It can be a small inventory. It can only have a few assets, each type in it. Then you need to match vulnerabilities to those assets. And then you need to conduct a business impact assessment. So we're walking you through the risk assessment process. You need to identify any threats that could take advantage of those exposures. And then you need to evaluate the control effectiveness. And finally, calculate a risk rating. So that is your assignment. I wish you good luck with it. If you have any questions, send us a message. If your organization is interested in doing a workshop or a seminar, then let us know about that as well, and we'll be happy to help you out with that. Now let's do a little test. Let's see how much you've learned here, okay? So what type of vulnerabilities do your assets maintain? Architectural deficiencies, defects in final products, misconfiguration, advanced technology. So I checked all the first 4 boxes, so this one's an easy one, right? Environmental, nature, human behavioral, and product materials. So this doesn't always happen, but in this case, for this question, we have 8 different types of vulnerabilities, and here they are. Question number 2, how do you receive cybersecurity threat intelligence? Oh, you receive it through the OWASP. Good. US Cert. Not management meetings. FBI.gov. Sure. Project Honeypot. Yes. The exploit database. Yes. How about newspapers or television? No, not really. Question number 3. Identify the 5 criteria used to evaluate internal and external threats. Skill. Age is not. Nationality has nothing to do with it. Skill and capability, definitely. Knowledge, absolutely. Gender, no. Resources, yes, definitely. And motive, of course. And we try not to motivate threat agents so that they don't want to come after us. Some are unavoidable because they're after our intellectual property or our capital, they're after our money. So we can't do anything about those, but some other types we can, such as disgruntled employees. We can do a better job at managing employees, exit interviews, dealing with issues in-house on our team, and taking care of business generally. Okay, question number 4. Identify 4 criteria out of the 8 options used to determine cybersecurity incident likelihood. Latest patches are not used, no. Loss of confidentiality, yes, because we're talking about what's the incident likelihood. Awareness training, no. But loss of availability will help us determine what the impact is. Loss of integrity, yes. Competency, no. Internal audit, no. History of events, yes. So remember I said sometimes, although we don't base our risk assessment on qualitative information, we may still ask managers who have been there for a while or employees, have they ever experienced any kinds of breaches of security or integrity issues where data had to be restored, or any of the losses of availability where we've had network outages or lost a database or a server, or cluster, or blade, what have you. Question number 5. How do you use threats, vulnerabilities, and impacts to determine likelihood? Okay. Do you identify assets and scope? Yes. Do you ask the executive team? No, because their job is to run the business. If you go around asking the executives what kind of threats, vulnerabilities, and impacts they have, they're probably going to look at you and say, isn't that why I hired you? So don't ask them. Quantify business impact. Yes, that will help you to determine what the threats and vulnerabilities are. Could you do a survey with vendors and suppliers? Probably wouldn't help. Analyze potential threats. Yes, that will help. Dump all system logs. That would be not a good thing to do. Analyzing system logs are not fun. That's why we have security information and management systems, and we have collectors to pull logs and analyze them using pre-designed, preconditioned formulas. Do we test existing controls? Yes, we do that. 6. Map the following risk ratings to its respective response criteria. So remember I mentioned there's 5 scales. We went over that. We went over the colors and the risk ratings and the service level objectives of how many days it takes to respond or recover from one of these incidents. So where does extreme fit in? Extreme is, yes, that's right. It's risk rating 90 plus, code blue. How about critical? Critical is code orange. It's 80 to 89 risk rating, 4-hour recovery. High is code red, risk rating 60 to 79, and you have 10 days to resolve that. Extreme? No, sorry, 4, medium is code yellow. That's correct. Risk rating 30 to 59, and it takes 30 days to resolve it. And then finally, low, and that's code green. There is a risk there, but it's not seen to be a huge risk, or else we would increase the risk rating and treat it immediately. Code 5 is code green. 5 is code green. Risk rating 0 to 29, and you have 0 to 90 days to resolve it. Okay, here's our progress chart. We have completed lesson 1, 2, 3, and now lesson 4. And that's lesson 4 of 23, so we have a little ways to go yet. But I think you're probably gathering a lot of information now and feeling very confident about what you're going to be doing next. So congratulations for finishing this lesson. And be sure to tune in for lesson 5. It's coming up. Thank you.